We're going to look now at the question of community television and how it can be combined with public libraries, the internet, QR codes, and other forms of communication like websites or weblogs. And we're going to consider the total transformation of global public education that this can imply. It doesn't happen automatically, but these new tools and new experiences with new skills can lead to the total transformation of global public education. This is accomplished mainly through crowdsourcing for human survival. Community television, public libraries, the internet, and the transformation of global education. It's got enormous potential because with local stations combined with networks of libraries across the country, combined with new communications technologies and the creation of online assets like websites and blogs, the internet can, in effect, combine these things in a way to revolutionize understanding. But this is not easily achieved. In an era of the corporate control of media conglomerates, citizens face the challenging question, where can we turn to learn? Where can we turn to learn? We need to consider the struggle for truth in the Anthropocene, in the face of official disinformation, corporate propaganda, and the pervasive sense of public mistrust. So let's consider this briefly.
You write in Manufacturing Consent that it's the primary function of the mass media in the United States to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and the private sector. What are those interests?
Well, if you want to understand the way any society works, ours or any other, the first place to look is who is in a position to make the decisions that determine the way the society functions. Societies differ, but in ours, the major decisions over what happens in the society, decisions over investment and production and distribution and so on, are in the hands of a relatively concentrated network of major corporations and conglomerates and investment firms and so on. They are also the ones who staff the major executive positions in the government, and they're the ones who own the media, and they're the ones who have to be in a position to make the decisions. They have an overwhelmingly dominant role in the way life happens, what's done in the society. Within the economic system, by law and in principle, they dominate. The control over resources and the need to satisfy their interests imposes very sharp constraints on the political system and the ideological system.
When you talk about manufacturing of consent, whose consent is being manufactured?
We can, to start with, there are two different groups. We can get into more detail, but at the first level of approximation, there's two targets for propaganda. One is what's sometimes called the political class. There's maybe 20% of the population which is relatively educated, more or less articulate. They play some kind of role in decision-making. They're supposed to sort of participate in social life, either as managers or cultural managers, like, say, teachers and writers and so on. They're supposed to vote. They're supposed to play some role in the way economic and political and cultural life goes on. Now, their consent is crucial. It's one group that has to be deeply indoctrinated. Then there's maybe 80% of the population whose main function is to follow orders and not to think, and not to pay attention to anything. And they're the ones who usually pay the costs.
All right. Professor Chomsky, Noam, you outlined a model with filters that propaganda is sent through on its way to the public. Can you briefly outline those?
It's basically an institutional analysis of the major media, what we call a propaganda model. We're talking primarily about the national media, those media that sort of set a general agenda that others more or less adhere to the extent that they even pay much attention to national or international affairs. Now, the elite media are the sort of the agenda-setting media. That means the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major television channels, and so on. They set the general framework. Local media more or less adapt to their structure.
World News. Begins to sound like it says that there's a beachhead.
I think 628 is a good one.
Yeah, but I think 6 good start.
This is the operative soundbite for us. He's ours. He really knows how to do this.
He's got a minute for all the time, so that's...
I love this soundbite.
And they do this in all sorts of ways, by selection of topics, by distribution of concerns, by emphasis and framing of issues, by filtering of information, by bounding of debate within certain limits.
2.5 minutes to air. 45 seconds.
They determine, they select, they shape, they control, they restrict in order to serve the interests of dominant elite groups in the society.
There is an unusual amount of attention focused today on the 5 nations of Central America.
This is Democracy's Diary. Here for our instruction are triumphs and disasters, the pattern of life's changing fabric. Here is great journalism, a revelation of the past, a guide to the present, and a clue to the future.
The New York Times is certainly the most important newspaper in the United States, and one could argue the most important newspaper in the world. The New York Times plays an enormous role in shaping the perception of the current world on the part of the politically active, educated classes. Also, the New York Times has a special role, and I believe its editors probably feel that they bear a heavy burden in the sense that the New York Times creates history.
What happened years ago may have a bearing on what happens tomorrow. Millions of clippings are preserved in the Times library, all indexed for instant use, a priceless archive of events and the men who make them.
That is, history is what appears in the New York Times archives. The place where people will go to find out what happened is the New York Times. Therefore, it's extremely important, if history is going to be shaped in an appropriate way, that certain things appear, certain things not appear, certain questions be asked, other questions be ignored, and that issues be framed in a particular fashion. Now, in whose interests is the history being so shaped? Well, I think that's not very difficult to answer. Now, to eliminate confusion, all of this has nothing to do with liberal or conservative bias. According to the propaganda model, both liberal and conservative wings of the media, whatever those terms are supposed to mean, fall within the same framework of assumptions. In fact, if the system functions well, it ought to have a liberal bias, or at least appear to, because if it appears to have a liberal bias, that will serve to bound thought even more effectively. In other words, if the press is indeed adversarial and liberal and all these bad things, then how can I go beyond it? They're already so extreme in their opposition to power that to go beyond it would be to take off from the planet. So therefore, it must be that the presuppositions that are accepted in the liberal media are sacrosanct, can't go beyond them. And a well-functioning system would in fact have a bias of that kind. The media would then serve to say, in effect, thus far and no further. We ask, what would you expect of those media on just relatively uncontroversial, guided free market assumptions? And when you look at them, you find a number of major factors entering into determining what their products are. These are what we call the filters. So one of them, for example, is ownership. Who owns them? The major agenda-setting media, after all, what are they? As institutions in the society, what are they? Well, in the first place, they are major corporations, in fact, huge corporations. Furthermore, they're integrated with and sometimes owned by even larger corporations, conglomerates, so for example, by Westinghouse and GE and so on.
What I wanted to know was how specifically the elites control the media. What I mean is, I guess...
It's like asking, how do the elites control General Motors? Well, why isn't that a question? I mean, General Motors is an institution of the elites. They don't have to control it, they own it. So what we have in the first place is major corporations which are parts of even bigger conglomerates. Now, like any other corporation, they have a product which they sell to a market. The market is advertisers, that is, other businesses. What keeps the media functioning is not the audience. They make money from their advertisers. And remember, we're talking about the elite media, so they're trying to sell a good product, a product which raises advertising rates. And ask your friends in the advertising industry, that means that they want to adjust their audience to the more elite and affluent audience. That raises advertising rates. So what you have is institutions, corporations, big corporations, that are selling relatively privileged audiences to other businesses. Well, what point of view would you expect to come out of this? I mean, without any further assumptions, what you'd predict is that what comes out is a picture of the world, a perception of the world, that satisfies the needs and the interests and the perceptions of the sellers, the buyers, and the product. Now, there are many other factors that press in the same direction. If people try to enter the system who don't have that point of view, they're likely to be excluded somewhere along the way. After all, no institution is going to happily design a mechanism to self-destruct. It's not the way institutions function. So they all work to exclude or marginalize or eliminate dissenting voices or alternative perspectives and so on because they're dysfunctional. They're dysfunctional to the institution itself.
Here we are once again at CCTV, and I'm Hines. I'm your host, and we're gonna go interview some people on the street and see if they know what Community Media Day is. I'm here with
Riley.
Riley, nice to meet you. I'm Hines. I'm from CCTV, and I just want to ask you a few things. Like, do you even know what Community Media Day is?
I have no idea.
I do not know what that is.
Not a clue.
I do not know.
I don't either.
Community Media Day is a national event that celebrates awareness of spaces like CCTV that offers equipment, studio space, all that good stuff for just people in the community. How does that sound to you?
Sounds pretty awesome.
Sounds good for the community.
I agree. Does that sound to you? Do you even know that CCTV even offered that, or if CCTV was even in Central Square?
I've walked by you guys a couple times, but I've never really had any other interaction or knowledge of you guys.
Actually, I really didn't know CTT really helped the community like that. I just walk by this place every day. I really didn't know what really went on in there. I thought it was like not public, but you know, private industry thing. So now that you're out here talking to me, now I know it's for the community. You know, so now I guess CTT does outreach and do everything for the community, what the community needs.
We offer spaces for podcasting, just audio recordings, anything really. If you're just interested in creating, wherever your mind can take it, we have the space for it and the equipment for it. Are either of you guys interested in doing a podcast or making videos?
Not necessarily. Maybe it's something I've thought about, but not super seriously, you know?
I think I get nervous in front of the camera. Like I can't even like look at it right now, you know? So like I think that wouldn't be like my thing, but I think it's cool to have spaces available for people that are into it, you know?
Are you guys just in Boston?
We're actually right there. You can show it on the camera. Right there across the street, that green building. You can kind of see the CCTV neon right there. And there you have it. CCTV has ran out of hats. We have given them all away to the community. And I hope I see you between the dates of October 20th to the 27th as a new member. But yeah, that was Hines and Anderson. And we're out.
Where can we turn to learn? Where can we turn to learn is really a struggle for truth in the Anthropocene. This is not easy, especially in the face of official disinformation, corporate propaganda, and pervasive public mistrust. This is what we're up against now, official disinformation from the highest sources in governments, corporate propaganda from every sort of sponsored source, and pervasive public mistrust of all institutions. How can you seek out information and start to learn in this kind of context in the Anthropocene? Take the case in point. What's going on in the White House at this point? How can we find out? Where can we turn to learn? You can say, well, a spokesman will make it clear, but in fact, spokesmen don't usually make it clear. In fact, they usually obfuscate and create a great deal more complex confusion in everyone's mind than clarity. So just the existence of a spokesman doesn't make it clear what's going on. What were the details of the president's hospitalization, for example? Why were they not made public? Even more telling, if he was ill, why did the doctors permit him to tour the block in the SUV, where he seemed to be waving to what he regarded as his fans, if not supporters? Furthermore, why is the public not being told the one question that correspondents keep asking? When did the president test negative for the last time in the COVID-19 epidemic? Well, this has led people to try to deduce from his behavior and from the information fragments that we receive what kind of condition he has. And you can hear this kind of speculation almost every evening in the news.
In terms of the way that the information about the president's health has been conveyed to the public, it hasn't inspired confidence, both because of the lack of specificity from Dr. Conley, from the way that he's waved off certain questions without explanation of why he's waving them off, but also because he's given some inconsistent information, including stuff that he's had to go back and revise. If you could wave a magic wand and invent a new spokesperson to give us meaningful information about the president's condition that you think the American people should have. You just mentioned a few things there, chest CT or chest x-ray, his basic labs, potential blood gas reading. What are the things that you think that we should demand to know about the president's condition in order to better understand his level of illness?
You bet, Rachel. So anybody that comes in with shortness of breath and we think they're high risk for COVID-19 and then proven, in the president's case, to actually have it, these are what I want to know, especially if they're gasping for breath. The way the president looked like he was actually audibly gasping for breath after he did what we call a modified stress test walking up a flight of stairs. What I would want to know when somebody like that is, I want to see a chest x-ray and a high resolution CT scan of the chest. Let me take a good look at his lungs and see if there's any type, what we use the term as technical term, an infiltrate or ground glass opacities. Those are technical terms. What we want to know is there evidence of pneumonia, something filling his airways in his lungs? The answer probably is yes, absolutely, because they gave him dexamethasone and remdesivir. There would be no other reason to give those medications. There's no FDA-approved reason to give those medications unless it was for COVID-19 pneumonia. I'd also want to get renal or kidney markers because we know COVID-19 can impact the kidneys. Want to make sure the president's kidneys are doing okay because a lot of patients that go into the ICU for severe COVID-19 pneumonia have kidney failure, need dialysis. Let's see how he's doing there. What about something called a D-dimer? It's the type of lab value that helps us risk stratify the president, in this case, as to whether or not he might be at a high risk for blood clotting. Because as you know, Rachel, this has been talked about at length, COVID-19 patients, especially those in the ICU or with severe illness, are at risk for blood clot.
What's holding them back from giving the public the information? Well, we don't know for sure, but there are some interesting parallels to previous circumstances. Last year, when Trump spent some time at the Walter Reed Military Hospital, he asked all the doctors that dealt with him to sign non-disclosure agreements. That in itself is very interesting.
Joe, as we continue this conversation, I want to mix in some new reporting just posted by Carol Lee and Courtney Kuby of NBC News. You were asking about these doctors and why they can't come out and give straight answers and what happens to these people. Well, we may have part of the answer in this new reporting from Carol and Courtney, which explains that during the visit, that mysterious visit to Walter Reed in November of 2019, President Trump mandated signed NDAs from physicians and non-medical staff, most of whom are active duty military service members. At least 2 doctors at Walter Reed then in 2019 refused to sign the NDA, and they were subsequently not permitted to have any involvement in the president's care. So the president asking doctors to sign non-disclosure agreements. Again, this is not for his visit a few days ago, but for his visit to Walter Reed, that mysterious one. We still don't know why he went exactly in November of 2019.
Well, it certainly wasn't for a routine checkup, or else, of course, you wouldn't have doctors sign NDAs.
Wow.
Which again tells us that the president is just as misleading about his health records as he is about his taxes.
That was last year, in 2019. It's not clear that these same doctors now, treating him in 2020, have been asked to sign non-disclosure agreements. But it'd be worth finding out about that. In any case, it became clear that there were so many people infected at the White House that it became known as a kind of hotspot at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, a hotspot for COVID in Washington, D.C. Staffers were quite angry, and they started calling the Amy Coney Barrett announcement of her nomination as a candidate for the Supreme Court in the Rose Garden as the Rose Garden Massacre, because so many people appear to have picked up the coronavirus, not only outside, but in the inside receptions that were held in her honor and the honor of making this appointment. Dr. Fauci warned to take this virus very seriously. But it's not clear he's being listened to by the White House.
Donald Trump says he's never felt better and he's eager to hit the campaign trail after his doctor wrote a memo clearing the president to resume public engagements from Saturday.
I think I'm going to try doing a rally on Saturday night if we have enough time to put it together.
Trump tested positive for the virus October 1st, and Saturday will mark 10 days since his diagnosis. The Centers for Disease Control recommends self-isolating for at least 10 days after a positive test. The guidelines then call for 2 negative tests 24 hours apart. While Trump may say he's feeling great, Dr. Fauci, the government's top infectious disease expert, warned not to underestimate the virus.
I don't want to be commenting specifically about the specific things that the president is doing. What I can say that we should not trivialize this disease. This is a serious disease. It's killed 210,000 Americans, infected more than 7 million others, and killed 1 million people worldwide. So it's not something that you should take lightly.
Meanwhile, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has unveiled a bill under the 25th Amendment to assess presidential fitness. It would establish a 16-member bipartisan panel of medical experts and former statesmen who would be able to determine whether to remove a president from office against their will because of a physical or mental incapacity.
Trump has plans to resume his campaigning on Saturday, and in fact, Speaker Pelosi has announced an investigation into the suitability of the 25th Amendment. A very interesting development. Why would the president be so desperate at this point, in effect, get back on the campaign trail and to appear as though he's a serious candidate for this office? Well, we're reminded by Professor Snyder of Yale University about what is motivating President Trump at this point.
What does a desperate Donald Trump do? Because a desperate Donald Trump is different from a desperate Ali Velshi or Tim Snyder. He's got things at his disposal that we don't have. What do you make of this?
Well, I think he also has problems that you and I don't have. He's in a different situation than he was in 2016. In 2016, he could win or he could lose. Now in 2020, you don't see the kind of lightheartedness that you saw in his campaign in 2016. Everything is dead serious. I mean, so serious that, as you say, it looks desperate. And there are reasons for that. One is that he doesn't have money. He's about $500 million in debt. And once he's no longer president, people are going to come to collect. And the second is he's under investigation for crimes. He and his companies are under investigation for crimes. So long as he's president, he can hold that off. So from his point of view, this is a struggle for life and death. He's not just desperate, as you say, because he's down in the polls or because he thinks he's going to lose. He's desperate because he's in that typical authoritarian situation, which is unfamiliar to Americans, but very familiar to people around the world, which is that if the leader loses, he's afraid of jail and he's afraid of the poorhouse. So that's the structural situation that he's in. There's no reason to be hysterical about it or consider this alarmist. That's simply the way he's looking at the world right now.
What's the other side of the equation? What's the part that we're not hearing, where there are probably military leaders in this country saying, you all are talking about what happens if he doesn't have a peaceful transfer of power. Don't worry, we got this. Or people who are thinking through how they will preserve the institutions that we all rely upon, that we think of as democracy.
That's a really important question, because the institutions don't protect themselves. The institutions only protect us if we protect them first. So if we sleepwalk through November thinking that everything is going to work out automatically, then we're going to have big problems. It's right, as you say, that the military will not intervene. However, what Mr. Trump has been trying to do since the summer are two things. First, he's been trying to change the Department of Homeland Security into an agency which acts against what he perceives to be domestic terrorist threats. And he himself has defined a threat as people protesting around the right to vote. The second thing that he's done is he's been encouraging American citizens to take part in voter intimidation. So these are the things that we have to watch out for. These are the things that we need to be alert for, even as we are calm. And by the way, these are also the things that law enforcement has to pay attention to. In the weeks to come, law enforcement at every level, local, state, and federal, needs to think, am I following the rules here, or am I bending or breaking the rules on behalf of someone who is desperate to stay in power?
It's clear that the entire exchange has reflected very poorly and, in fact, destroyed the reputation of major American institutions, in particular the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. It's for this reason that a scathing indictment came forth from a former director of the CDC, Dr. William Fauci. Dr. William Fauci wrote a letter that became public this last week to the current head of the CDC, Dr. Redfield, in which he suggested that Redfield resign and apologize to the American people for the mistakes he made, while indicating to the faithful doctors working within the CDC that they will receive his continued support from now on. If he's fired by the president, at least he will have stood up to the president on the point of principle. This is what Dr. Fege emphasized. Let's listen.
The letter to CDC Director Robert Redfield says in part, quote, the first thing would be to face the truth. You and I both know that. One, despite the White House spin attempts, this will go down as a colossal failure of the public health system of the country. The biggest challenge in a century, and we let the country down. The public health texts of the future will use this as a lesson on how not to handle an infectious disease pandemic. Two, the cause will be the incompetence and illogic of the White House program. Three, the White House has had no hesitation to blame and disgrace CDC, you, and state governors. They will blame you for the disaster. In 6 months, they have caused CDC to go from gold to tarnished brass. That is the beginning of a private letter that was sent to Dr. Redfield late last month. Although we don't know who leaked it, it was written by a legend in the public health world, Dr. William Fege. Among his many achievements, Dr. Fege is largely responsible for the eradication of smallpox. He served for 6 years as the director of the CDC, and for his lifetime of public service was presented with the nation's highest civilian honor, the Medal of Freedom. So what he says carries real weight, and in that letter to Dr. Redfield, he did not mince words about the need to stand up to the Trump administration, telling Redfield, quote, resigning is a one-day story, and you will be replaced. But you could send a letter to all CDC employees laying out the facts. You could, up front, acknowledge the tragedy of responding poorly, apologize for what has happened and your role in acquiescing, and assure them that you will defend their attempts to save this country. Don't shy away from the fact that this has been an unacceptable toll on our country. It is a slaughter, and not just a political dispute. The White House will, of course, respond with fury, but you will have right on your side. When they fire you, this will be a multi-week story, and you can hold your head high. That was what a leading voice in public health was calling on Dr. Redfield to do just last month. Stand up to the president and be willing to lose your job in the process.
Dr. Fege became recognized not just in this country, but around the world for his role in eradicating smallpox. It's for this reason that he received the highest civilian award available in America, and President Obama presented him with the Medal of Freedom. It's true that a heroic declaration urged upon the director of the CDC, Dr. Redfield, by a former director and recipient of this highest medal of honor, Dr. Fege, could be a first step in reestablishing public trust in the capacity for truth in government. But this would only be the first step in a very long journey to restore government respect for and credibility in the sciences. The reason is the sciences have been under sustained and long attack from all recent Republican administrations. Ever since the scientific evidence was published about coal plants and acid rain when Ronald Reagan occupied the White House. With the assistance of billions of dollars of petroleum money from ExxonMobil, the Koch brothers, and the groups they supported and sponsored, the Republican Party has systematically embraced suicidal anti-environmental policies. Further, the dark money that they've provided has come to affect and infect not only politics, but the educational institutions around the country as well, to such an extent that we see Most of the major institutions have not divested from fossil fuels. On the contrary, they begin in the administrations of these schools to see the world very much like the corporations they reveal themselves to be. Their faculty has come out in favor of divestment. Their students are in favor of divestment. But as corporations, what we've learned is that despite these protests from students and faculty, universities behave like corporations, maximizing return in the short run. This is why fossil fuels still seem attractive to them to invest in. Places like Yale are even more deliberate and explicit about the collaboration. The William F. Buckley Jr. program has been established at Yale largely with the support from the American Enterprise Institute to debate things like, do fossil fuel divestments work for universities? Interesting way of framing the problem. Not should we divest, but are we making money from them? Then, if the conclusion is yes, we make money from them, why should we divest? A very interesting perspective, underwritten, as I say, by the American Enterprise Institute through the William F. Buckley Jr. program at Yale. This is why Rhodes Scholars and other groups of international scholars, independent of any one institution, have begun to warn of the transformations required by the global climate crisis. The primary voice among them has been Gus Speth. Demonstrating outside the White House, he made it clear that it's time to step outside the system and do some things we haven't done before. We've got to take our protests to the highest levels of government, in this case, the Obama administration. Gus Speth had his training at Yale to begin with, and then at Balliol College in Oxford, where other voices are also critiquing the free market and its devastating impact on the world environment. Kate Rayworth, in her new book, Donut Economics, is a great example of this. And Gus Speth has continued to publish as well beyond his retirement. This new edited piece on new systems is very important and worth reading cover to cover. He's looking at the alternatives to a failed economy. As Cambridge Community Television recorded years ago, he was in the front lines along with Bill McKibben. And in effect, our culture under Barack Obama was criminalizing the best and the brightest. This was a very sad chapter in American history, not uniquely Republican, but under a Democratic administration, arresting both Bill McKibben, Gus Speth, and James Hansen in the same demonstration, pointing out that we're headed in a suicidal direction with fossil fuels. The populist politics and the war on science has increased with a new momentum with the recent Republican administration. They've simply eliminated the information that taxpayers paid for and used to be posted on websites, important websites of government science organizations. But as Trump put it, from this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. It's going to be only America first. Not understanding any of the science of climate change, there is no such thing as an American atmosphere. You can't control the global flow of greenhouse gases. You need to be part of international organizations in order to self-regulate, in order to avoid extinction. But the war on science has continued. And in fact, it's been amplified by people like Senator James Inhofe, writing books like Global Warming, the Greatest Hoax, and holding up a snowball on the floor of the Senate, as if this proves that global warming doesn't exist. Globally, the Republican Party in the United States has become the preeminent force for climate change denial in the face of irrefutable scientific evidence of this unfolding tragedy now confronting all of humankind. So President Trump's science denial is not in any respect new to the Republican Party. In fact, it's only the most recent expression of a deep-seated perspective that can be seen now to have cost the lives of 210,000 Americans and millions of fellow human beings in the current global pandemic. At this point, the major task of our government, in the eyes of the world, is to acknowledge the need for a massive transition toward sustainability and engage from now onwards in the serious scientific study of how to achieve this in order to survive in Earth's finite ecosystem. Where can we turn to learn? Well, it's going to be a struggle for truth to begin with in the Anthropocene, in the face of official disinformation, corporate propaganda, and pervasive public mistrust. But we've been warned, if you do not change direction, you will most likely end up where you were headed. The warning of an ancient Chinese proverb. Very unsettling for those of us in America who realize that we have become thoroughly dependent upon fossil fuels. They're non-renewable, and we will not be renewed if we cannot make the transition away from fossil fuel dependence. This is why transition studies are crucial to help illuminate the way to a just and sustainable future on a finite planet.